All right, everyone. Thank you all for joining. We will be starting shortly. I am going to mute everyone, and as soon as our final presenter gets on, we will go ahead and start. But thank you all for being with us today, and we look forward to our time with you.
Hi, welcome everyone. This is Lavashton Glenn. I'm the co-chair of Grant Makers for Southern Progress, and also I serve as program director with the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation. We are so happy to have you for Grant Makers for Southern Progress first webinar of the year for 2018. And I'm extremely excited about the conversation we've organized today with the amazing organizers and leaders with the Black Voters Matters Fund. But before we jump into the panel or the presentation, I would like to give you a little information about Grant Makers for Southern Progress. We are a network of foundations and philanthropic organizations seeking to learn and build relationships and leverage resources for better social, political, and economic outcomes for those who are most marginalized in communities across this region. And as a network of national and Southern funders, GSP conducts research in order to elevate the leadership and infrastructure that exists and working to transform conditions in the region. Some of you all may have read the series of reports in partnership with NCRP entitled As the South Grows. In addition to the reports, GSP hosts learning tours in the region, holds biannual regional convening, and is currently developing a race and gender equity leadership program. I'm going to pause for a second because someone needs to mute their background. Thank you. So I was saying GSP, in addition to doing these reports with NCRP, we host learning tours in the region. We actually hold a biannual regional convening, and we are currently developing a race and gender equity leadership program for foundation staff, which is scheduled to launch in 2019. But enough about GSP. Let's talk about building power in Black communities in Alabama and in the Deep South. One of the things I do want to remind us of is sort of the flow of the conversation today. I am happy to have with me Tamika Mosley, who is our program coordinator with Grant Makers for Southern Progress. So she's going to be helping us out today on the call. And the call itself, or the webinar itself, is organized into 4 parts. We're going to hear from LaTosha Brown and Cliff Albright, co-founders of the Black Voters Matters Fund. And then we'll switch to a panel discussion with 2 leaders from the Black Belt, Helena Bell and Teresa Bettis. And then we'll open up the conversation for Q&A. And again, as Tamika mentioned, if you have questions, please the chat and we'll get them in the queue. And then we'll close out this webinar with some closing statements from our speakers today. So at this time, I'd love to turn it over to Cliff Albright and LaTosha Brown, co-founders of Black Voters Matters Project. We are, again, so appreciative of their time and their leadership. A little bit about LaTosha Brown. LaTosha actually is the former program director with Grant Makers for Southern Progress. But before her work with GSP, LaTosha is an award-winning organizer, philanthropic consultant, political strategist, nonprofit and philanthropic sector. If you all had a chance to she definitely has a lot of passion and commitment to folks in the South, and so you're in for a treat to hear from her. Along with LaTosha is Cliff Albright. Cliff is also co-founder of Black Voters Matters Fund. which builds community and organizational capacity related to Black voting power. He's also the principal consultant at Strategic Cliff Notes. Some of y'all might know Cliff hosts a weekly radio show in Atlanta and has served as an instructor of African American Studies and has contributed to articles to The Guardian and other online publications.
Jackie, what happened? Jackie? It just went off.
Yep, Lavashin, I think yours is on mute. We can't hear you.
Oh my gosh, I've been talking that whole time and you guys couldn't hear me?
We heard towards the end
Okay.
say about Cliff's radio show, and then we didn't hear anything else.
Oh, okay, that's odd. So Cliff has hosted this weekly radio show in Atlanta, has served as an instructor of African American Studies, and has contributed articles to The Guardian and other online publications. Cliff previously lived in historic Selma, Alabama, where he's focused on bringing financial resources to Alabama's Black Belt region. He incorporates a community organizing perspective based on more than 20 years of social justice activism. So I will not hold up this conversation anymore. Cliff and Latasha, you have the stage.
Okay, thank you. Cliff, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Okay. All right. So good afternoon to everybody. So glad you all could join us. As Lavashin said, and thank you to GSP for setting this up. As Lavashin said, I'm Cliff Albright, along with Latasha Brown, co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund. I'm going to kick us off just by giving a little bit about Black Voters Matter Fund and what our core beliefs are. And I'm going to try to weave in how those core beliefs were kind of reflected in the work that was done in Alabama for the special election. And then Latasha will come in and drive home a couple of really, really important themes, particularly as it relates to philanthropy. So the first thing we believe, we have 5 core beliefs. The first of those is really, I think, what really drives our work. And it's that we believe that the key to effective civic engagement and community power is understanding the importance of local infrastructure. And so wherever we go, and starting in Alabama, there's often this perception that there is limited, or in some cases, no existing local infrastructure, existing electoral infrastructure, organizations that are able to really engage in this work in a deep and meaningful way. And Latasha and I's position is that's not the case. That wherever we go, we have existing infrastructure that is engaging in electoral work, but more importantly, engaging in organizing and providing services, and just strengthening our communities. We always talk about, you could go back to even in the slave community, right? That there was still existing local infrastructure. Like, we've never been without a collective of people, a group of people who go out of their way, sometimes with, sometimes without resources, to strengthen our communities. And so that's our starting point. And so the work that we did is really about the work that our partner organizations did. And what we did was we supported 32 organizations in 18 counties all throughout Alabama. And I have a list. This is just a list of some of our partners, a couple of whom are on this call. And when you look at the list, what you see is a diversity of organizations and groups, some that do electoral work on a regular basis, some that do other aspects of social justice, some that don't even do organizing work, but that they do social services, right? We've got a youth organization, after school, arts and cultural programs. And so, but the commonality is that they all had authentic relationships in our communities, right? And so when they went out explaining to folks, we need you to come out, we need you to come out, you need to go vote, they were able to relate in a different kind of a way, and it was accepted in a different kind of a way than if it's coming from strangers or so-called experts that often parachute in and they go around the existing infrastructure, around the existing organizations and ground those existing relationships. We reject the parachute in model, and we really believe that it's all about strengthening, supporting whatever existing infrastructure and existing organizations are in place. And like I said, we had a diversity of organizations. One of the groups in Jefferson County was dealt with immigrant rights and immigrant justice, and we were proud to have them a part of our coalition. Secondly, we believe that Black voters matter not only on election, but 365 days throughout the year. This means that we have support individual organizations that are striving to obtain social justice throughout the year. And certainly that entire list that I just showed you and others, that's what they do. They're doing this work 365 days out of the year. And so it was no huge task for us, to come in having identified them, being familiar with the work, because Latasha and I have done social justice work in Alabama for years. Latasha's born and raised in Alabama. And so really supporting those organizations that are doing that work 365 days out of the year. But the 365 days core belief also means a couple of other things. One, it means that we've got to be involved in connecting, networking, capacity building throughout the year. So we're not just interested in our partner organizations just for election day or 2 weeks before election day or 1 month before election day. And we don't think that they're interested in each other just for 1 week, 2 weeks, or 1 month, right? And so we view a big part of our role as helping to connect, helping them to connect to each other, helping them connect to out to other organizers or organizations in other states, helping to connect with philanthropy, like on a call or a webinar like this. But that process of connecting, providing the space for folks to come together, to strategize, to share lessons learned, just to reinforce that we're not crazy, right? That there's benefit to and necessity, not just benefit, but necessity to that process taking place all throughout the year, whether it's in the form of webinars and conference calls or in-person convenings or whatever the case may be. The second thing that's also related to the 365-day belief is that we've got to support, and this is really important for funders to understand, particularly funders and interested in civic engagement and elections, but that we can't just support elections in November, right? We've got to be willing to support communities throughout the year, because the reality is in many of our communities, particularly in the South, right, the election that really matters isn't so much the general election. The real battle oftentimes is in that primary. It's in May and it's in June. But some funders aren't quite as interested in those battles because ultimately some folks are really focused on flipping a state, right? Flipping a legislature or flipping a congressional seat. And so that's part of the reason we often say we're not just about we're not just an election organization. We're not just a civic engagement organization. We're about building power in Black communities, right? And so that has got to take place 365 days out of the year. And that often involves races that are local and races where the real battle is during those primaries. But it's very hard to say, and in fact, hypocritical for us to say, we need you to come out in November when communities are looking at us and saying, well, where were you in May? And where were you in June when we had this battle going on? We were trying to get rid of this incumbent judge or this incumbent district attorney who's a Democrat, but that's where the real battle was, right? Because they're oppressing our communities just as much as the other folk are, right? And so, but if you can't show up, if we can't show up for that process in May or in June or whenever those primaries are, it's then hard to come to Black folks in particular in November asking us to save the world or asking us to save the country or to save the state by flipping because we're only important in November. So that's 365 days of the year. The third piece, Black voters matter everywhere, including in rural counties and small cities and towns that are often ignored by candidates. This is absolutely critical to what we do. And we talk about Black voters, when we say Black voters matter everywhere, we talk about the rural communities, but it also means that Black voters matter even in the cities where sometimes people will pay attention to us, but they won't pay attention to all of us in the cities, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But on the rural piece, this is just a picture of Alabama's Black Belt. Depending on who you ask, Some folks will define it different ways. You might get 18 counties in there. You might get 20 counties in there. You might get 14. But this is kind of the traditional depiction of Alabama's Black Belt. And when we look at the election results, what we see is there's a collective impact of these Black Belt counties, right? And so when you look at the numbers of votes that Doug Jones got, what we see is out of the 11, it's actually 12 out of the 18 that we supported were Black Belt, but I only did the numbers on 11. But when you do the numbers, the votes that Jones got in just the Black Belt counties collectively was around 48,000. Well, that's equivalent to the votes that Jones got in Montgomery. As you can see, it's more than the votes that Jones got in a city like Tuscaloosa. It's comparable in places like Mobile and Madison County, which is where Huntsville is located. And so in essence, when we ignore that region, when we ignore that Black Belt, as many organizations do, even progressive organizations, right, weren't interested in investing in the Black Belt. But when we ignore that, what we're essentially doing is we're ignoring the same kind of impact as you can get in one of Alabama's major cities. And the same goes throughout the South. Right now we're looking at Georgia, we're looking at Tennessee, we're looking at South Carolina. And when you look at the Black Belt areas in those counties that are heavily Black, it's the same story. The collective impact of these regions carry the same impact as a major city, right? So, but we're not just saying Black voters matter there just because of that. The other piece is they matter in those places, in these rural counties, because we matter, period, right? The quality of our water matters there, the quality of our healthcare matters there, the quality of the school systems matter there. And so this is a message that we're constantly trying to reinforce to folks. And the last piece I'm gonna talk about, I'm not even gonna talk about in great detail, the fourth of the 5 core beliefs. Black voters believe they matter when we communicate with messaging that is authentic and which speaks to our issues. I'm not going to go into much detail on that because that's very much connected to a piece that Latasha is going to talk about in her segment. And so I'll just leave it at that, that the way that we communicate has got to be different. It's got to be different than what's been done traditionally during our election campaigns, whether it's the parties or the candidates, or even in some of our organizational work, that there are some issues that we believe that we've got to speak to that sometimes folks are afraid to speak to. There are issues of power that we've got to speak to that folks are sometimes afraid to speak to, or issues of race and racism that we've got to speak to. But again, I'm gonna leave a lot of that for Latasha's piece, because that plays an important part in the way that people perceive the work that we did, the work that our partners have done in Alabama. And so with that said, I am going to turn it over to Latasha.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Cliff. One, I just kind of want to reiterate as we kind of go forward in the presentation, just to give a context of understanding around when you look at the rural South, and when you look at 80% of rural Black voters live in the Black Belt. So it's really interesting that the Black Belt region that stretches all the way through South Carolina, Georgia, all the way to Alabama, the majority, 80%, overwhelming majority of Black voters, of rural voters, of Black rural folks who live in this country, actually live in that swath of the region, which oftentimes get very, very little investment. And there's a tremendous amount of power there. And there's a couple of things I think it's really important in terms of having kind of a context of what happened in Alabama, what happened in the election. I think that there's these two pieces that I'll just kind of share quickly, and even in the statement that came up, that there's this idea that somehow, it's this magical moment that Black people in Alabama woke up and they went and they voted for this Democrat because that's where we saw, that was going to be our salvation, the Democratic Party, and then when Doug Jones voted, and he voted against. In some way, we were let down once again. And we intentionally, even for us, that's not why. So, and just a couple of quick points, that's not what happened in Alabama. There's a couple of things I think are misconceptions that I just want to just get out early on. First thing is that the work in Alabama that created the victory in December is a culmination of work that has been happening for years, where grassroots organizations, people do civic engagement work, from lawsuits to other elections to doing the civic engagement, community grassroots organizing work with or without resources and as a combination of that. So it's a layered approach. This has happened. So what you saw in December was a culmination of that work. And I think it really reiterates how important it is that we're supporting networks and infrastructure in the area. The second thing that I want to raise in terms of what happened in Alabama is that this election was not about the Democratic Party. Prior to the pre-Obama years, the Democrats controlled most of the state houses in the South, although they voted in the presidential election Republican. So I think it's really important that we don't marginalize the strategy and the thoughtfulness of Black folks using voting in a way that just strategically, we understood what having a Roy Moore of a person who is aligned with a conservative right and a current presidential administration, we knew the implications of that. So I think that there's a level of even sophistication in rural Black voters that's often not a part of the narrative. And I think it's really important that we share that part of what happened is, and we spoke to that in our message. So in our message, we specifically, what was not happening is prior to the election, people were not necessarily excited about Doug Jones. Contrary to belief, we didn't know him. You know, even in his own commercials and his own, by his own statements, you know, the thing that they connected him to was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. He had been the prosecutor in that space. The challenge with that is neither Cliff or I was born during that time, and many of you that are on the phone. So that was like you're referring to something that happened 50 years ago. So people are in their everyday lives have challenges, and they were not necessarily connected to this idea of getting Doug Jones or this idea of getting a Democrat. It was actually connected more of around Black liberation, particularly around self-governance, and us speaking to what was important for us in terms of making our decision. Even the day prior to the election, I'll just raise this, the day prior to the election, all the news media was saying that Roy Moore was going to win. Local media was also saying that he was going to win. And but we've been able to distinguish, particularly those organizations and those folks that are doing work on the ground are listening to the ground. We're not listening to the air, we're listening to the ground. And I think you see some movement around that. The next thing that I share is, I think it's really important in this context around how we see narrative and who led the work. So there is this narrative that is out there in terms of the voters were Black women, and while 96% of the voters were Black women, that's true. The other part of the narrative is missing, though, is that this work was actually led by Black women, that there were three major Black mobilization efforts. They were all led by Black women. And I think what you see is, even in the work that we supported, and 98% of all of the groups that we funded were led by Black women. So I think it's really important in this narrative that we see Black women just not as voters, but as strategists and as organizers and as leaders as well. And then the third and the last point that I will kind of raise is around, can you go to the next slide, please? I want to raise around kind of when you're looking at civic engagement investment. If the slide that's up there, if you're looking at in New York City, and when you're looking at per capita grant making, it's almost $2,000. It's $1966. When you look at just in the United States, across the United States, it's $451 per person. When you break it down to the South, and as you're looking at the South and the states, and from Alabama to Louisiana, but when you look at Alabama's Black Belt, it is $28. That is significantly less than other places. And then when you look at civic engagement, can you go to the next slide? when you look at the civic engagement numbers, it's even far less than that. So even in the United States, if you're looking at civic engagement, which is underfunded, $39 a person, it's less than 51 cents in the Black Belt. So how is it that in the poorest in one of the poorest regions in the country, in a region that has not been invested, it's because there is an organized, grassroots, organized infrastructure that, be it needs support, to be strengthened, augmented, but it does exist. And I think that that's a missed opportunity. If you switch to the next slide. And so I think that what was really important, the last point, the last 2 points that I'll make is one around communication and what message is given. And so what we were hearing, even in our work, we were hearing on the ground folks saying that they weren't necessarily excited about Doug Jones or even Roy Moore. And part of even Doug Jones had a commercial that was out that opened with a Confederate general, and then it had a Union general, and then he comes out and he says, you know, I want to be like them. I want to be the candidate that is compromises. And so those of you that know Southern history know that what the Great Compromise was about. So that message did not resonate. So that's why it was a need. And I think part of our work and our approach to this has been creating authentic messages that we lean into the question around race. We lean and embrace the question around inequities in these communities. And that moved people in a way that we actually spoke to, even in commercials that we ran. We spoke to one candidate was not the candidate, the other candidate was not a Dr. King, but that ultimately this election was about us in a way that was affirming. And so as I get ready to stop so you can hear from some of the people in our network, you know, what the strength of our work, and I think what you saw in Alabama is it opens up a couple of things. I think it opens up possibilities for us to look at the South in a different kind of way. I think possibilities for us to even look at the rural South, that the rural communities have been overlooked and ignored just across the board. You know, and I even think that you see the rise of the current administration that was able to tap into that. But also there's a narrative that rural communities are some angry white men, as if people of color don't live in those areas. And when you look in the rural South, there are swaths of African-American people of color who are living in these states who could be a progressive force, a power, what we saw in Alabama. We also saw that in Tennessee, in South Carolina, and some other places. So we think there's a real opportunity for us to build off that. Some of the other women that you'll hear from and some of the people who are joining us on this call today were folks who are part of our network. They were part of the Black Women's Roundtable. The Black Voters Matter Network, but also are leaders who have credibility, have been doing this work in their own communities and wear several hats. So I'll stop right there so that we can hear from them. So I'll just go on and bring on Helena. Helena, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I want to bring just quickly, it shows Helena was the former mayor of Hayneville. She's also very engaged in the Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative and is a part of the network of the Black Voters Matter Fund network as well. And even recently, I just want to highlight that recently, as part of our accountability measure, there was a delegation of us rooted with Black women from Alabama that actually went and met with Senator Doug Jones to really speak to him about some of the things that we were concerned about and the infrastructure in Alabama. With that being said, Helena, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Latasha. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Cliff and Latasha for actually being able to see that there is an infrastructure already in place. You saw that when we seem to have been ignored by so many others. So I want to say thank you for that. Also, thank you for allowing us to participate on an even larger scale by investing in us and understanding that we have the people in place that have been doing this work for years and years, trying to get people of color elected into these positions, positions such as judges, county commissioners, myself as mayor, and we're having to fund this ourselves, but you saw the need and said, okay, let me reach down and get these people to help us to get Doug Jones in office, and then perhaps you can help us to get some of our local leaders in office, and understanding that it is the lack of funding that's causing us to stand still and not be able to get these people in office sometimes. Because what's happening is funds are pouring in for the other candidates, but then for our candidates, we're having to use personal funds. People are doing the work for free, like they've been doing for so many years. We're still doing that. But I also wanted to talk about is let me just look at my notes, the messaging part that you all bring to the table. That is so important, because a lot of times our candidates, and even us as we're trying to help our candidates with the message, we're trying to get them a message that the people can relate to. We're missing. We don't have enough of what they need, but you came in and you're helping to share exactly what the people need to hear. That's a big part of what's happening here. Understanding what the needs are and then helping the candidates to put this in a message that the people can relate to. And I want to say thank you for that. That has been very, very helpful for us. To talk a little bit about the work we've been doing with Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative, we have been registering people to vote, getting people out to vote. We have been having community meetings, helping people to understand policy, actually going to, if there's a situation with the school board, sometimes there are parents that are hesitant about actually communicating with the leaders because they're afraid that they're not speaking the language right, or either they just don't understand what's happening with their children. So what Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative has been doing, these women are actually going to the meetings with the parents. They're actually going to court, no law degree at all, but just trying to help them to understand what's happening in the courtroom, what's actually happening in the school board meeting, how that is actually affecting their children. That's some of the work that we have been doing at Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative. And is there anything else that you want to talk about? You could just ask.
And then Helen, can you talk a little bit about the infrastructure? If you could just mention kind of this rural infrastructure piece. Infrastructure
is a huge issue here. Whenever there's a cycle for applying for grants, we're always applying for these grants for our water issues. Clean water, clean drinking water is an issue here, and of course the sewage system. Our sewage system has been in the ground since the early 80s, and it needs so badly to be replaced. That's an issue here. While money is being sent to the states, a lot of times, because it's so competitive, and actually being able to write the grants and finding the engineers and not having the funds to pay the engineer ahead of time for the design, because a lot of times that design work is not able to go into the grant. That cost can't be written into the grant. A lot of times, just to compete for a grant, we're already behind the 8 ball, just to get in there to try and compete. So the money is being sent to the state, but oftentimes it's not reaching the Black Belt. Now, mind you, the agencies are willing to work with us, but as far as funding and enough funding reaching us, that's just not happening for us. And let me bring up one point about broadband and the internet service. Internet service is a huge issue for our area, a huge issue for our students. I was sharing with Latasha at one time that I work at a funeral home. My husband and I own a funeral home. So we happen to be right across the street from the telephone company where the internet service, the servers are. So the students are coming here saying, can I use your computer? Can I do my homework here? Can I use your computer to apply for a job? That's happening so consistently that we just have one set aside over here just for them to keep them from using my personal one. But every once in a while, I got to say yes. And then they're texting me, and I just got to go ahead and give them my password so that they can log on, because this is so important to them. And it's important to whether they pass their grade or not pass their grade. So those are the kinds of things that are happening. And we're not the only ones in the Black Belt that are doing that. There are grassroots organizations that are actually helping, but no funds aren't coming in.
Thank you so much, Helenor. And then so with that being said, I want to also give the opportunity for our next presenter to speak as well. who is Teresa Bettis, and she is executive director of the Center for Fair Housing. She also created a number of years ago with some of the work that was happening around environmental justice and another issue. She formed and was founder of the Southern Alabama Justice Coalition, which is made up of grassroots groups throughout the southern region of Alabama. And she's she's our coordinator in Mobile, the Black Voters Matter Southern Alabama. With that being said, and just been an amazing organizer and of that community. So with that being said, Teresa, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Thank you. First of all, again, I just want to say as well, thank you to Cliff and Latasha for their foresight and their leadership in seeing an issue and jumping on top of that and being a trailblazer in addressing, many of the issues that plague us here in the South. So I'm the director of the Center for Fair Housing. We are a private, nonprofit civil rights organization. We are located here in Mobile. We service 8 counties in the southwest portion of Alabama. And so we open our doors. We're actually celebrating 20 years of service this year. And we hold the unique distinction of being the only fair housing center in the nation that was developed out of a lawsuit. And it's one of the largest race discrimination rental cases of discrimination that has been settled in the United States. And with that, because of the fair housing work in the broad depth of the fair housing law, it allows us opportunity to go deep into issues within the community when we look at matters surrounding affirmatively furthering fair housing. And so out of that broad body of work, and after Katrina hit, and then we had the BP oil spill, we saw a need, a way of trying to bring together community people across the region and trying to give them tools to help them be leaders and advocates in their own communities for themselves. And so as such, we developed the Regional Justice Leadership Summit, and we always hold this every year in the month of April. We're getting ready to do that as well this year. Our dates are April the 18th through the 20th. This year, we're looking at issues such as civil asset forfeiture, how the new tax code will impact housing and economic development, immigration and DACA, and civic engagement and community organizing, because we recognize when we look at issues around housing or environment or public health, all of those things, we don't get anywhere if we don't help the community organize themselves and give them the tools to get out there and make the impact. And so as the election was coming up this past year, we were kind of feeling kind of dismal here in the Mobile area. We were really concerned about people getting out to vote. We were seeing a great amount of apathy here in our area. And what I can say is that without the support of Black Voters Matter, that my organization would not have been able to participate the way that we were with this crucial body of work. So the impact we helped to make would not have happened. The community would not have had this opportunity to be recognized and supported in the political process. So that was very important. I want to talk a little bit about messaging. And what we found about messaging is that it is just as important that you get the right people and use the right vehicles to get the message out. We find that you can have a really good message, but if you use people who don't look like the people who live in the communities, if you don't communicate with them with the way they communicate, then your message will not be as effective. And so we find that it's really important to engage those groups that are already working on the ground with your messages and let them help you to get it out, because we're already trusted by the community. The message, as I was saying, making sure that the people that if you're going into communities of color, brown and Black communities, and you send people who are Caucasian, who've never been into those communities, they don't know the gatekeepers of those communities. The people don't know them, and they are not as effective. And oftentimes they don't get through. And when we talk about grassroots organizing, we had some really great experiences with our millennial volunteers that were able to get out and talk to their peers. And they were able to share information. And I'll share one specific story. There was a young man who had some blemishes on his record. He thought that he couldn't vote. And after talking with our volunteers, and they provided him with some information where he could call and find out. And in fact, he did find out that he was eligible to vote. He was kind of disheartened because he thought he was out of the process. But not only did he go and vote, he came back and found those volunteers and said he was so excited. He said, I went and voted. And so that's the type of thing of using grassroots people on the ground who know the community can make happen. And we just used everyday people. You know, we had a young lady, you know, named Quita. And Quita was the kind of person, she would just knock on your door and say, hey, why y'all tripping? Why aren't you going out and voting? And she could do that because the people in the community connect with her. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really important. And then we, you know, on the day of the election, you know, we had quite a few people who had signed up to work, and they were saying, you know, well, we'll just work a little bit of the day. We can't work all of the day. But guess what? By the time they came back in for lunch, they were so fired up and so empowered about the message of not necessarily getting Doug Jones in office, but that it was an opportunity to do something for our community and to do something for us and to exercise a right to vote that had been given to us through blood and tears, you know, of our ancestors. And so they stayed the whole day. They didn't leave like they initially said. And that is the type of stuff that really helps us to really push forward and do what we do, whether we have the money or not. We try to make it happen. And then I'll share one other thing about, okay, go ahead.
No, please share, continue to share.
Okay. I was just gonna say, lastly, that is, it is extremely important to have the support and the connection of other grassroots organizations that are working in the region. And the reason I say that is because if we have the resources and the ability to come together and build a cohesive body of work, then we have a message that is cohesive as well. So that it doesn't matter where you are, if you're in Florida, if you're in Mississippi, or if you're in Alabama or Louisiana, the message is the same. And so that helps to build a brand for what we're trying to get out there. It helps to give us greater recognition and credibility, because no matter where you go, you're hearing the same message. And so for those of us who are nonprofits that survive primarily on restrictive grants and donations, there's definitely a need for some additional funds that could help us do what we already do, but it allows us to expand that body of work for which we're already engaged in. And so that's what I wanted to leave with you all today.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And then I will, Tamika, I'm going to turn it back over to you. A couple of quick things that I want to bring up, like to give context in terms of who was on the ground. There were also grassroots organizations from Florida and neighboring states that actually came and supported and even were a part of our operation to be in solidarity and work with groups where local groups were on the ground. And they came in, we had a partner in Georgia that actually was trying to figure out how they could help. And they were all grassroots community-based groups. And they did phone banking. So there was phone banking that happened outside. There were folks that came in and they would actually help drive the vans and be drivers and do what's needed. So part of this regional context of how this work happened, there's another group that I do want to lift up as well. And Kenny Glasgow, who was one of our partners with the Ordinary People Society, that there was over 5,000 folks who are in jail who still have not lost their right to vote, that actually were registered this last election cycle, and many of them were able to vote this election cycle. So there were grassroots movements that you didn't capture on CBS and some of the other places. The last thing I'll say quickly is CBS did a story about a week ago, and the title of it was "There's a Movement of Women in Alabama, a grassroots movement of women." And disheartening, it was, if you look it up, you know, it was a big story they did. They didn't include any Black women in it. It was really interesting. It was focused on South Alabama and white women. And I think that part of what's really interesting in this piece, and I'll say this as I close, that as we're looking at this work, that the narrative that Black women in Alabama don't become a footnote in their own victory, and that we're actually lifting that up and we're sharing that story. So Tamika, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, everyone. I am especially going to take this time to open the floor for questions. We have some questions in our queue, and I will read them off and allow the panelists to include Cliff and Latasha an opportunity to respond to them. So our first question is from Beth Glenn, and her question states, for social services and even local organizing groups used to working in the C3 context, how did you overcome hesitancy to engage around elections, even in ways that are permitted, because people fear that the increased scrutiny civic engagement work might draw?
So, and I actually want Teresa to answer that because both Teresa and Helen we have a C4 side, but we have a C3 side. But we, many of the groups that we work with were actually C3. And part of the reason it was actually them tapping into their own constituency base and being able to connect this issue, even for us. Teresa, let me turn it over to you. Let me let you answer that question.
Hey, I'm sorry. Would you repeat that question for me quickly?
Sure. For social services and even local organizing groups used in the work of the C3 context, how did you overcome hesitancy to engage around elections, even in the ways that are permitted, because people fear that the increased scrutiny around civic engagement work might draw?
Okay. So what we did, first of all, we had already looked at the Hatch Act, and we made sure that we weren't violating anything there. The work that we didn't actually conduct it in my office site. We did it off-site. It wasn't done the times that we were out working. It was when the office was closed. On that Tuesday, we just closed the office. I mean, it was a regular working day, but we just closed the office. And one of the things that we just really realized that it was just too important to not be involved and engaged. And I think you just have to ask the right questions. Because we made sure that none of our other grant dollars were expended towards the activities that we were doing. We had spoken with our organizational attorney and just kind of gotten some clearance on that to make sure that we were clear. And so those were kind of some of the steps that we took. But it was definitely something that we were going to do regardless. We were going to make it happen.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Teresa. Are there others that would like to respond?
This is Eleanor Bell, and I like to say for our organization, we really push the Black Voters Matter, and it's about us. That really resonated with the people, that it's about us. As it has been stated so many times, it wasn't just about Doug Jones getting in office. It was about being able to produce something for our own community, to do something for ourselves in our community. And I think that people were really able to wrap their minds around that and embrace that idea that this is about us, that we deserve better. That message meant a lot to the people in my community.
Right, thank you so much.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that, I think it's a challenge that we've seen in some of the other places that we're doing work, in some of the other states, even more than in Alabama. I think, for the most part, most of the organizations, the C3 nonprofits, had a pretty good understanding of where the line was, right, and what they can go up to. And it was important that we had mechanisms for people to do both, for folks who were in a space where they could do a more directed message, and for folks who were just doing, it's about us, nonpartisan, just trying to drive out the vote. I do want to mention, I'd be remiss if we didn't mention, there were two organizations in particular that really helped us with our fundraising and even some logistics. The Movement Voter Project, particularly on the C4 side, was a huge help. But on the C3 side, the Education Foundation of America was a huge help in terms of being able to provide, especially the election day resources to get, to allow our C3s to be able to do the nonprofit GOTV, because folks had already done enough in the lead off to get people motivated, but without that infusion on the day of. And we never suggest that people just wait to the day of, right? But there are situations where having that kind of rapid response at just the right time can be a huge help. And so I just wanted to lift them up. But most of the C3 organizations that we work with in Alabama with this campaign, felt pretty comfortable going as far as they can go in terms of just energizing folks, empowering folks, right? And making folks be excited about going out to vote.
The only other piece I want to add real quickly is around the role of community philanthropy and community controlled philanthropy. A key partner for us also was the Black Belt Community Foundation, who had a mechanism because of their grantee base to be able to move small amounts of money to folks. I mean, all election day and a couple of days before that, Felicia was hemmed up at the bank, literally wiring resources to community organizations that were doing nonpartisan work. So I think it's really important that even in this space, it was almost like having a relay, having a community-based fund that had existing relationships and was nimble enough to be able to move, to meet and serve as an intermediary for groups to be able to get resources was invaluable.
Yes.
All right, thank you all so much for lifting those thoughts up. The next question is from Erin Dell. Her question states, I've been hearing about all of this investment in Alabama civic engagement infrastructure, but your slides show little investment. What happened? How do we shift this narrative?
We're glad you're asked. So, and there are two organizations that are on the phone right now. Ask them where they got resources from, like outside of us. Helenor, did you get any resources outside of us?
No, ma'am.
Teresa, did you get any resources outside of us?
Not one penny.
So I'm not raising that in any way to pump up and say Black Voters Matter or about Black Voters Matter. I'm really not. I'm raising it in a way to say that there were millions of dollars, and it's often the case in general, there were millions of dollars that we found out even after the election that flooded in the state, and it has also been a mechanism to support white national intermediaries that are in this political space, that they spend millions and millions of dollars on television ads, on flyers. It's almost like it's its own hustle. What we were not seeing, and part of the reason why we had to kind of act quickly to try to get some resources, we do not see the kind of investment in the infrastructure. Most of the infrastructure that exists is actually self-funded and is community funded. That's why I think it's really important for us to have a broader conversation around how do we create these alliances that we're supporting networks, that we're supporting community funds, that we're supporting folks who strategically can be intermediaries so that grassroots groups and the folks who are actually doing the work get the resources. We did not see that in Alabama. We saw national organizations come in and get millions of dollars. They're not there anymore. We haven't seen them since. And part of that problem is it doesn't necessarily feed or lend itself and strengthen the existing infrastructure. So I think that's a real point of contention and a discussion that we should have around why it's really important for us to shift even the strategy of how civic engagement dollars get to communities, particularly communities of color.
Thank you, Latasha. Would others like to respond? All right, so we will move on to the next question. The next question was lifted up by Andrea Lynch, and it states, first of all, thanks so much for this powerful and informative presentation. I work with a lot of national funders, and those who wish to fund the grassroots often struggle to do so for practical structural reasons, since many of the organizations doing transformative work are not C3s or even C4s, or maybe too small for a large funder to fund directly. Black Voters Matters and others are important actors in this landscape. Can you share a bit more about the advice on how to bridge the gap between powerful work that is under-resourced or and funders who don't have the capacity to make small grants, or who struggle to find intermediaries across the South that are, one, equipped to make the grants, and two, politically aligned?
Thank you so much for asking that. Cliff, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, you can support us and we'll find them for you.
If we've already supported you.
I'm laughing, right? But I mean, literally, that's a part of how we see ourselves and how we see, like Latasha said, intermediaries like the Black Belt Community Foundation, right? And so we have, in places like Black Belt Community Foundation, have the interest, the ability, and the relationships to do that type of funding that other folks can't or may be hesitant to do. They're not quite able to figure out, who's legitimate. Like some people are okay with our premise that there's existing infrastructure that they're not aware of, but they're just really uncomfortable or unfamiliar with. Well, how do I identify those folks? And Latasha and I always say, and we travel through these states. We had a deep understanding of Alabama, and we have an understanding of the South in general and the states that we're looking at in general. Georgia, we're based in Georgia and Tennessee and South Carolina and Florida. But even for us, we still believe that we have got to travel to these communities, to these counties. We were just in Tennessee, and not just in Nashville and Memphis, right? But also in the rural counties surrounding Memphis that nobody really goes to, right? And so we believe that we've got to go there and touch the ground and shake some hands and smell the air and see the buildings, because we always say that we're organizers and organizers know organizers. And so we're able to, and there's a process by which we're able to really identify who's doing good work. It's not always about who's got the pretty website and a nice documentation and all of that, but it's about really looking at the work, really looking at the relationships, looking at how folks respond when you say a certain community member's name or a certain organization's name, and just seeing what type of responses you get, even randomly, right? And so there is a process to being able to identify organizations like that, and there's a process of being able to go through and support organizations. I'm literally, as I'm sitting here, I'm getting a text from one of our Georgia partners that we have walked through the process of how to incorporate. Because many of the groups that we find and support, they're literally groups. They're not organizations. Not only do they not have their C3, they may not be incorporated. Truth be told, they might not even have a bank account, right? And so we might be figuring out how to do different types of arrangements, whether it's PayPal or Cash App or whatever it is. But but that takes time, and it takes a willingness to do that type of work. It takes an understanding of how to do that type of work and how to get folks to get more formalized, to get to the next level. And we understand not every funder wants to do that, but what the default has been, and I'm going to say this real quick, and I'm sure Latasha has some thoughts, but what the default has been to say, because it's so difficult, we're just not going to do it. And that's what produces the results on that slide that we showed that Latasha spoke to about why there is so little funding, and in particular so little funding for organizing. Folks will say it's difficult, we can't do it, we don't know anybody else who knows how to do it, so it just won't get done. And what we're saying is partner with us, partner with folks like Black Belt Community Foundation. We have that skill, capacity, and more importantly, that interest. We are committed to doing the type of identification and capacity building and funding that other folks just may not be able to do.
Thank you, Cliff. Latasha or other panelists would you like to respond to this?
There's just a quick piece that I want to say, and I want to, sometimes when we're saying we've got to fund Black work or the Black infrastructure, I think people take it as it's something that we have to do. It's almost a spirit of benevolence. Like in some way, we're going to support the rural South because of benevolence. Right. Without seeing, not that it's benevolence, it's actually strategy. Yeah. And it's part of the challenge of where the weakness of where your flank, when you're in war and you don't have your sides covered, and where your opponent is setting root and you're not there, what do you think is going to happen? Mm-hmm. It wasn't by accident. I'm going to bring up, it wasn't by accident that the President 45, Trump had his first rally in Alabama, y'all. It wasn't by accident, right? And if you look at where he actually was able to build his base, it was in these rural communities throughout the South. The challenge is there's some power and there are numbers that can actually beat back that, right? If there's investment, I love to tell folks, we were able to do what America couldn't do. We shut Jeff Sessions down. Right, in Alabama, the Alabama Black Belt and the organizing that happened in the Black Belt actually shut Jeff Sessions down when he was trying to get a federal judgeship, something that the country wasn't able to do even when Trump appointed him as Attorney General. I say that to say that there's a missed opportunity, that there is progressive power in these rural communities, and because we don't see what we've created and adopted a national model that looks at concentrated high density voters and leave your entire, there's the reason why Georgia and other places have 159 counties and they've got these strongholds is because the rural communities are completely left uninvested and not as a part of the process. So I think it's really important for us to not think of our need, if we're trying to build a progressive movement, to support the rural South out of benevolence, but out of strategy and out of how we're going to anchor and will win statewide. There has to be some anchors in these progressive pockets that exist throughout the Black Belt.
Thank you, Latasha. So the next question comes from Ryan Siegel. Ryan's question is, thank you, GSP and Black Voters Matters Fund for co-hosting this webinar. Could one of the panelists talk about ways in which the culture within mainstream philanthropy can change in ways that would lead to more and better funding relationships with Southern grassroots leadership? So Ms. Helen or Cliff or Latasha or Ms. Teresa?
I would love for Helen or Teresa to respond to that since they're leading this work directly on the ground.
And Ms. Helen, you're unmuted, so if you could unmute yourself.
Hey, can you repeat that question?
Sure, I can. So the question is, thank you, GSP and Black Voters Matters for co-hosting this webinar, I'm sorry. Could one of the panelists talk about ways in which the culture within mainstream philanthropy could change in ways that would lead to more and better funding relationships with Southern grassroots leadership?
Okay. The way that it could change in funding the Black Voters Matters is that for so long, we have not been funded. There's a lack of funding here, and in order to grow, then there's going to have to be funds put into our areas in order to make a difference here. We sometimes say that why are we not voting for our own? For example, in my area, we have a 80% Black vote, 20% white vote, and we have never elected a Black district judge in our area. And it's because of funding. That's because they are able to gather all of their friends and they're putting funds in our area, whereas the people of color, they just don't have the funds here in this area. And then the others that are on the outside, perhaps they're not aware of the need or aware of what it's going to take in order to get a candidate elected. The same thing that it takes to get a white person elected in our county is going to take it to get a Black person elected. And you may say, well, these are all Black people, why don't they just vote for a Black person? Well, we are a poverty-stricken area. People are very, very poor, trying to get their power bills paid, trying to get their water bills paid. So when somebody comes and offers them money, do they not take it? So that's what I see.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, this is Teresa. So one of the things I think that could help to change is I think that the funders simply need to get to come and know who we are and the work that we do. You can't understand the cultural differences and the challenges that we face, you know, if you live in DC or if you're in the Midwest or if you're out on the West Coast. You just simply, it's a totally different world here. You know, what we've seen in an increase over the last few years is single mothers with children simply living out of their cars with newborn babies. And, you know, they call my organization and we help the best that we can. but our hands are tied because we don't have funding to address with the issues of the lack of safe, decent, affordable housing, our failing school system, you know, insufficient funding. Our newest mayor here in our city, one of the first things he did was slash funding to our social service agencies. And what's happened over the last 4 years since he's been in office is the percentage of crime with our youth, and particularly in communities of color, where these programs would have been in operation and allowing an outlet or a safety net for our children, those resources are gone. And when we go back even to the context of Hurricane Katrina, when we saw the Gulf South, you know, where there were funds that just flooded in, you know, Katrina pulled back the ugly cover on poverty and racism and a lot of the ills that happened here on the Gulf Coast. And although we had funders, national funders that came in and helped, it was only over a span of maybe 2 to 3 years that you saw the real push, but that can't undo decades of neglect. So there has to be a concerted effort to get to know the communities, to know the leaders. There were resources at that time after Katrina that were being put in to help those grassroots leaders, but it wasn't enough. And the need is still here, and if not greater, since that time.
And thank you, Teresa. I have 5 quick points. I'm not going to get to. I'm just going to put them out there. The first, when we're thinking about changing the culture of philanthropy, one, we've got to look at risk. And if we want to make change, I don't know how you make change and not take risk. If you're going to do the same thing we always been doing, let's see how that's not working for us. So I think it's really important to really think about risk and how we mitigate risk and how we address and embrace and lean into it. Secondly, I think it's really important to give grace and space to Black-led work. That I'm in often in these spaces where I see white organizations get all kind of thinking money. They get money to think, to plan, to retreat, what have you. Black-led organizations have a challenging time in even getting resources without showing the DNA of their firstborn and how they were able to get them through college without any incident. It's really this different standard in terms of how even those in the progressive, this different standard of how we see Black-led organizations, and even the origin and formation of Black-led organizations usually doesn't come out of professionalism of a nonprofit. It usually comes out of addressing a particular need. The third thing is, I'll say, is to support networks instead of this kind of frame of this has to be this particular organization. If you're looking and you're knowing the South that is actually made up of networks, then figure out a way that you can support networks. And the fourth and last point I raise is, I think it's really important that as we're kind of doing this work, that we think about moving money to fund this work. Imagine, this is what Alabama did with 51 cents. Imagine what they could have done with $1. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, and yeah, definitely. I appreciate everything everybody has said, and those 5 points Latasha made. I just want to add on 2 or 3 other ones. I actually just finished working on, not just, but most of last year was working on a research study with Grantmakers for Effective Organizations that was related to inclusion and strengthening philanthropy, strengthening relationships with grantee partners. And so there's a couple of just general observations I can share that aren't, limited to that publication that's not yet out, but just, general observations. One, when grantmakers that have done this well have had an internal process by which they've addressed this, right? And so it's hard to say we're going to try to have better relationships with grantees, particularly grantees in communities of color, when internally an organization, a grant-making organization, hasn't really fully embraced diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And so the process really has to start from within, including being reflected in terms of staffing, and not even just staffing in terms of race and ethnicity. Like, grant makers that invest in staff that may not be from the traditional backgrounds, but who themselves have a background in community organizing, they then turn out to see that they're better able to form better relationships with a more diverse group of organizations. So the first part is this whole process that really needs to take place from within philanthropy and within grant-making institutions. And then the second thing is, we really have got to really invest in relationships a different kind of way. I often say that, when we think about grant maker, grantee relationships, it's really not much different than how you think about any other relationship in your life, whether it's romantic or whether it's family. Part of it is about how much time that you're willing to put into relationships. So some grant makers that have done this effectively have looked at, how do we change our processes so that the amount of time that we're currently spending on, the paperwork and the documentation and some of the, mechanical aspects can then be shifted into, really building relationships, showing up in a different kind of a way, showing up in spaces where maybe even philanthropy may not be that comfortable, right? And so that's a whole other piece. And the third piece is that, that there are issues in terms of evaluation that we have got to deal with, issues in terms of metrics, issues in terms of time frames. We often say that, a lot of times folks are asking us to undo like 300 years of segregation and racism with like, in a 1-year grant cycle for $50,000 grant. And so there's just got to be a different way that we address, and there's some foundations that are doing some really good work in terms of trust-based philanthropy and just really looking at the entire process of evaluation from being one of less of punishment and consequences to really more of a learning process, right? It's a process by which we're not trying to decide whether or not we ding you in the future, but it's really just a process of trying to see how we can collectively can engage in this grant making process a little bit differently. So there's a lot more I can say about that, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
All right, thanks, Cliff. And we'll have a few minutes in the end to give you all some final moments or final thoughts. So we have one final question from Ms. Threats, and her question states, the story you just told about CBS saddens me, but doesn't surprise me. What can we do to be helpful in making the role you played clearer to others, especially funders?
Thank you so much for that. One, I will do a little shout out. We're actually, if you, Black Voters Matter, Cliff and I, and even our network, we've been trying to produce articles and at night we work in the daytime, and at night we've been trying to write to really get it out. So if there's some vehicles even within your own space, whether it's blogs, whether you do it or we do it, if you tell the story, we need you all to be the ambassadors to tell the real story about really what happened, and then support those folks who are actually doing that work. There are local newspapers, there are other folks there are writers, there are bloggers to really be able to support that as well. And I was going to mention what I started to mention is in this month, Ebony Magazine, some of our work is being featured in Mary J. Blige is on the front of that. And then next month, in Essence, some of the women included in our network will be featured in that as well. So I think there's a couple of things, a couple of quick things of what funders could do. I think seeing resources, I often challenge around, we see Black women as workers. We don't see Black women as creatives and as innovators. And so I would encourage and challenge those of us to really think about putting resources towards narrative shift so that we can tell our own story, and that you see women who are creating artistically and writing and journalistically, that we're able to really create and feed it to that narrative. Because the truth of the matter is, that's what I expect from CBS, but there should be a documentary, there should be work that documents in terms of our story so that we can tell our story. That's the first thing. The second thing that I'll say is I think it's really important that even through our work, and I appreciate what you all providing this platform, that even in your own work, you can help create platforms for other folks who are doing this kind of work in the region to really be able to share kind of their story, be able to share really what happened and share some of their strategies as well. So I'll stop there for the sake of time, but thank you for that question.
Cliff or Ms. Helen, Ms. Teresa?
Nothing to add.
All right, thank you all so much for your thought-provoking questions. And at this time, I will turn it over to Lavashtun if there are no other questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much wisdom. Thank you for all of your presentations. I heard a lot of information that we as funders can take back into our institutions and really began to think about how we show up differently in the region. The piece that really stuck out to me, if we go back to the investment slide, like 51 cents per person in the Black Belt, that's insane. So I feel like there's something that we can do about that. And then the reality of who we're talking about when we say the Black Belt, and that's across the states, multiple states in the South, that 80% of rural Black voters are in the Black Belt. So what does it mean when philanthropy doesn't show up and invest in those places? There was a lot of wisdom in what everyone had to say. And one of the things that stood out for me was the importance of investing in relationships. And I believe it was Latasha says, give grace and space to Black-led work. Give grace and space to Black-led work. And think about sort of the culture that we've created in philanthropy and the culture that's in the greater United States that only sees Black people, and in particular Black women, as workhorses and not as leaders and not as innovators. And think about how much space is given to other folks who are seen as quote unquote traditional leaders, and the resources that follow that when you see people as leaders. And then this note of importance to come and visit and get to know the people in the communities in the Black Belt. That's another way of connecting and moving this conversation forward. But also to not see this as charity and as, a deficit proposition, that the opportunity that Black Voters Matters Fund and the organizations on the ground are providing to funders is a strategic opportunity to build up capacity to transform the region. So having learned all of this in 90 minutes or short of 90 minutes, I wanted to give our panelists an opportunity to leave us with, either a statement about what's next for their work, or something, a direct message that they have in terms of how can the participants on this call and funders who care about progress in the South be engaged moving forward. And so if you all would take the final minute or two to give your thought on how can philanthropy be involved and be engaged moving forward.
So I will start, because I will I'm going to leave off, but I will start by just sharing. One, thank you all for providing this platform. This in itself is one way, that to really be able to provide a platform for the story, the narrative of really how this work happened, to get out there, I think it's really important. Secondly, I do think it's really important in terms of philanthropy. The purpose of philanthropy is to move resources. And the truth of the matter is, I'm not really sure why we're continuing with this debate around, is the South worthy of investment? Is there anything in the South to invest in? I mean, what else do we have to show? I think it's really important for us to really think about our biases that we have around Black folks, our biases that we have about poor people, our biases and judgment that we have about Southerners. There's a particular kind of misconception, I believe, that folks are not thoughtful, they're not strategic. Some of the most organized, well-organized people, I tell this anybody, that I've ever worked with and been trained are in Alabama and Mississippi, in the deep South. So I think that's really important. The last and final thing I'll say is I think it's really important to define what a win is. Like I said, Alabama's win was not about Alabama. Even since that time, we had some people we were working with in Tennessee, and they said they had been trying to get funders to fund them for the last couple of years. And when Alabama happened, they got a funder to call them the next day and say, well, hell, if Alabama can do it, you all can too. I think the Alabama win is greater than about Doug Jones. It's really about opening for us about what the possibilities could be around building a progressive movement and supporting progressive politics in areas that have been marginalized and underinvested. With that, I'll stop. Thank you all so much.
If I can wait, if Helen or Teresa want to add something, I can wait. Or
I'll just add that my same thing. If there's small investment, then there's small change. In order to facilitate a great investment in our community, a great change in our community, then there has to be great investment in our own community. Once again, thank you, Cliff and Latasha, for believing in us and having the foresight to see the treasures that are here in the Black Belt and how working together we can make a difference. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you as well. This is Teresa, and what I will add is that, you know, the people of the South are resilient. Here in Alabama, they're resilient, and I agree the investment is worthy of taking the time to take a second look, and I agree with what's, you know, been said before. I don't understand why we have to continue to keep trying to prove our worth. But if it took this previous election to do that, then so be it. But we just hope that it would spur on hastily movement from those funders who have the resources, who can help us really deal with the issues and organize our communities. And again, yes, it's not a handout. We just want what is fair and what other communities are getting. And so we hope that you would take that to heart.
And thank you. And then my two last thoughts would be, one, just in terms of funding. I think, you know, Latasha and I, and primarily through Latasha's work, were able to raise close to $200,000 in like an 8-day span. That's with great partners that we had. But it was also through commitment, right? It was through commitment that, one, we need to get this done. We must get this done. A belief that we could get it done, and then a commitment to you know, that we will find the ways to get it in the hands of those that need to do it. It was just a commitment and a belief in the entire process. And we know that there's a lot of difficulties, challenges, in terms of really committing to, not in terms of committing, because the commitment is the easy part. There's challenges in how this work gets done. But when we have the commitment, we can do anything. You know, as philanthropy has demonstrated that it can do anything once it makes up its mind, right? And so, but the challenge is that there really hasn't been a collective or a critical mass making up the minds that this work is important, and that 51 cents going to the Alabama Black Belt needs to look different. I really believe that once there's that commitment, then those numbers will change. The last thing I want to say is, and this is piggybacking off what Latasha said about the strategic importance of investing in this work. History shows us that when we invest in Black communities and Black organizing, the entire country wins, right? Whether you want to go back to the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, right? The entire nation has benefited from the 14th Amendment. The entire nation has benefited from the Civil Rights Movement. The entire nation has benefited from the Voting Rights Movement. I mean, whenever we invest in Black-led organizing, it's not just Black communities that benefit, the entire country benefits. Progressive policy moves forward. Even if we look at what's happened recently in terms of the gun control and the Parkland students, I really believe that you could draw a straight line from the young folks of Black Lives Matter to young folks of Parkland. And in the midst of that, you have the young folks of the Dreamers and the DREAM Act, right? But when we invest in the organizing that Black Lives Matter, and particularly young folks, have done over the past 5 years, in many eyes has not produced the victories, going back to what Latasha said about redefining a win. It has not produced the victories in terms of, you know, this case being won, right? Or this election being won. But it has changed the nature of protest and organizing in this country that has brought us to the point where we're seeing things in regards to gun violence that we've not seen in this country in decades, if not centuries, right? And so, but it looks different. That victory looks different than what people would have wanted a victory to look like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, as folks were organizing in Ferguson and Baton Rouge. And sometimes the challenge is that we don't get the micro victory that we want, and sometimes other folks get more of a victory than what we get. Sometimes every place outside of Selma benefits more than Selma itself benefits, right? That's the reality of our work. Not only does the rest of the country benefit, but sometimes the rest of the country benefits more than the folks who are doing the work. But I say all this to say that if we increase that 51 cents, if we can get other funders to show the same kind of commitment that someplace like Mary Reynolds Babcock has shown, and we really need to shout them out because many of the things that we're talking about in terms of organizing and providing space for folks to convene and the importance of relationships, there are folks like a Babcock that have been doing this, right? And so, for funders that really want to know how to do this, talk to them. Don't just talk to us, talk to them some more. So I just really want to say all that to really emphasize that if there's commitment, we can get it done. And if we get it done, it's not just these immediate Black communities that benefit, it's the entire progressive community that benefits, and indeed it's the entire country that will benefit from increasing our commitment and our funding for this work.
Great. Thank you so much, Cliff. Thank you so much, Latasha and Eleanor and Teresa. This has been a great conversation. We're ready to conclude this webinar, but for you all who really have questions and interest about investing in this work, please contact Latasha Brown or Cliff Albright or Eleanor Bell or Teresa Bettis, or Grant Makers for Southern Progress, Tamika Mosley, or myself, Lavashton Glenn. Again, thank you so much for joining this webinar, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody that gave their time.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much.